Welcome to the final episode of Season 3. My co-conspirators, Curt Newton.
Hello.
And Daveand Curt.
Hi, everybody.
And this is me, Rajesh Kasirangan, in the fantastic studios of MIT.
So we've taken on some really interesting stuff this season, taking different looks at what learning actually looks like.
So what did you guys mean by learning to change when we started all this enterprise?
We got to do things differently than we have been.
Mm-hmm.
We got to do it quicker.
Mm-hmm.
We got to do it bigger.
Mm-hmm.
We got to do it smarter.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to think that learning's got something to do with that.
And we got to learn how to bring individuals and communities and governments and businesses and divine retribution and everything else into one framework. I don't know how to do it, but I want to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, the interesting question is, who's the we here? You know, is the three of us in the room with our sound engineer, Dave Lashansky, or is it the whole world, or is it something in between? And, you know, what does that shift look like? What does transformation mean for me or for we? I don't know the difference.
For me, it starts with me in the sense of like, who can I speak for? And I think back to, you know, some of the things that really got us started on this theme, like change starts from within, right? And I'm left at the end of the season here wondering, how have I changed? How have I observed you guys changing through it?
So what's up for you?
Well, one of the things that's up for me is feeling increasingly urgent that, oh my God, we don't have time for all of this sort of thoughtful learning. There's too much to do. Mm-hmm. There's too much to do. Mm-hmm. You know, and you know, I'm left wondering, if that's my mindset, how do I create the space to actually take in new stuff? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Help me, Dave. Mm-hmm. Help me, Rajesh.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm really struck by the Mothers Out Front model, which is learning in community, helping each other to learn. And these are folks, often working parents that have lots of demands on their lives and don't have a whole lot of time. And yet they're somehow able to pull off that learning in community so that no one individual has to bear the whole burden. And that seems like a really compelling model to me.
So the big thing for me, and which is strange given my anarchist impulses, is how the possibility of large-scale state action is now not too far. You know, we were talking about the Green New Deal.
Not too far. You mean like we could be looking at it actually taking shape?
I hope we do, right?
We better be hoping we do.
Yeah, but I feel like come 2020 or maybe even earlier, you know, federal legislation that is transformative might be on the board. I mean, that would be it would be completely different from anything that we have seen in the climate movement before.
Mm-hmm. The question that I'm left with is, how do you scale? How do you go from one high school or one club in a high school or one local advocacy group, Mothers Out Front, whatever it might be, or one university like MIT teaching one freshman seminar? How do you scale those things up?
I have an answer.
Looks like you got an idea. Go for it.
Tell your story through a podcast.
Okay. All right.
So that gets the word out to more people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fireside chats from the president, but not the current one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you know, frankly, I've been reading about not just about the New Deal, but something that you could say I'm not terribly proud about, and we shouldn't be, but the Manhattan Project and how the nuclear bomb was built. You know, 130,000 people worked on that, which in the United States of 1942 or 43 is 1 in every 1,000 Americans.
Oh, right, in Los Alamos, New
How
Mexico.
Many of them knew what they were doing?
I don't know.
My sense is it was super secret,
and
right?
it used 1% of the electricity. Just that one project consumed 1% of the United States electricity.
Well, it's like Bitcoin.
Right? So it's happened. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the model to emulate, given what it led to, but I do think that you can start from scratch and commandeer very large amounts of resources to achieve a common goal pretty quickly.
So what's the connection to learning in there?
They had to learn how to build the industrial infrastructure. I mean,
for the nuclear bomb.
Yes, they didn't have it. And of course, they built upon the New Deal. So Oak Ridge National Laboratory is in Tennessee, and all the electricity came from the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was built by the New Deal.
Yeah.
So there's this cascading series of interventions. You need a New Deal to build the institutions, to then build the next stage. And so that's kind of collective learning that's, I think, very important.
And there's a really interesting thread of history and perspective that you get from understanding history in that as well. That's the thing we didn't touch on explicitly in this season, but we'd better hope that there are a lot of lessons like that from history that can inform what we're going to be doing, both on the positive side and things to avoid on the negative side.
Some examples come to mind, Curt?
Well, an example of thing to avoid, from recent history. There's this expose about palm oil and the deforestation that came along with that as a unintended consequence from a bunch of not fully thought out biofuels mandates, 10, 15, 20 years prior.
Yeah, George W. Bush.
And the things that were set in motion through that have turned out to have really devastating consequences for the climate. And I feel like there's a bunch of, cautionary tales that we might want to learn from a deeper study of history. And that's only one of the most recent, but we can go way, way further.
And that's actually why I love Quentin's safe to fail idea. Because if somebody had done a safe to fail experiment with palm oil, they would have figured out that cutting down rainforests in Borneo is not a great way to address renewable fuel, biofuels.
In other words, let's do a few test plots of a palm oil plantation and see what it looks like.
Right.
Well, it's tough to set up.
That's interesting, Rajesh, that you mentioned about safe to fail, because when I think about our three sets of guests, Terrascope at MIT, Mothers Out Front, and Boston Latin School, they were all experimenting. They were trying things out. Every year, a little different. Let's try this. Let's try that. And we could go back and recount lots of examples from all three of those sets of folks where they were learning on the job. They were learning by doing, trying it out. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, let's try something else, right?
And each one of them had different goals, and yet they were able to roll with the punches, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. As a community. Yeah, a learning community.
And I think that is very interesting because communities that are self-consciously learning communities, I think, are different from communities that just happen to learn.
In what ways do you think?
Because I feel like that message of we need to learn together is probably part of the DNA of the organization itself.
Mm-hmm. Got an example of a learning community that really you thought worked well, that influenced you?
So this is a kooky community, but it was actually one of the most influential in my life. So I was part of a group called Kira. So Kira in Japanese means star. And so Kira was this community which was science and other ways of learning. So the idea was that you combine scientific inquiry with philosophical, artistic, and spiritual ways of knowing. And so they organized these 5 summer schools in Amherst, at Amherst College. And people would come from all across the world and spend 2 weeks with each other. And every day they would create a joint project. Like everybody was part of a team that created a joint project. And people would be like, you would have writers and, mathematicians and...
It's like an artist colony, but broader domains.
And it was amazing the kind of things that you would think of after just being at it together for a week, right? Like this magic would happen. It would be pretty intense before that, and nerves and tempers and everything. But I really liked the idea of a very diverse group of people coming together with a blue sky mandate.
So diverse in the sense of representing different disciplines or
and
subject
cultures,
matter interests, cultures,
I mean,
languages, everything.
Everything.
Mm-hmm.
It was like it was a microcosm of an elite microcosm, because if you can fly down to Amherst College, you're not a very poor peasant somewhere, but nevertheless a very diverse group of people.
We're not talking about a one-day hackathon either. This is a thing where it takes some time for people to get to know one another, and there's space for new big ideas to take shape collaboratively.
And we had great mentorship. There were some very distinguished people who were mentors. And
those mentors.
Well, we saw that exact same thing that you're describing. We saw that in all three cases: Terrascope, Mothers Out Front, and Boston Latin. There were developmental stages that they went through, getting to know each other, who's in the room, who knows what are your skills, what can we learn from each other. And then they took off, all of them, at different stages of their development as a learning community.
And you never know. I mean, it's not. I don't think you can bottle that magic. Like each group has its own chemistry. But when it clicks, I think everybody knows.
And it's a process that you have to go through. You can't, like you're saying, you can't just walk into the room and all of a sudden it happens. But it's a process that facilitators like Kate Arnold, who is the faculty member at Boston Latin, who helped start that, Vanessa Rule and Mothers Out Front, others are facilitators. They're sort of helpers in getting the group to gel and become a community of learners. It takes time.
So that's the other thing that learning tells us, right? Patience.
And I think that we thought we were urgent before. Oh man. Certainly the conversations I'm having with people who have been climate engaged, that's a really common feeling.
Right.
So the clarion call of the IPCC 1.5 special report, saying we got to be 50% reduction by 2030. One of my biggest questions lingering at this point is, what's a learning model look like that can take on that scale of a challenge of speed?
We're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah.
Right.
We're going to have to figure it out. We're going to have to run some really well thought out rapid experiments over the next couple years.
Right, but we saw those sorts of things unfolding. If you think back to the conversation we had with Susan Tang, who is the leader, the student leader at Boston Latin, she was observing, hey, in the beginning, we were talking about recycling and things at the household level, and now we're talking about the whole school level, the whole school system level, and we're bringing in younger people or teaching and training the next generation within the school, and we're focused on different kinds of issues. It's not just the household and can you recycle the plastic, which is still good, but it's much larger scale. How can we change the system? How can we, Rebecca Park was talking about changing the standards for teaching, changing the testing standards. That's where you make a systems level, an institutional kind of change, and you can use those objects. I mean, I'm speaking to your concern, Curt, about we don't have time. So maybe it's a matter of changing the object of change from individuals and households and families to institutions. Have to learn, have to get more nimble, have to get more responsive. Don't you think?
Yeah, I feel like actually one of the most important forms of learning right now might be learning how to identify when something's not working and flipping the script on it, right? And so there's so much momentum built up behind the forces that have led us to this climate crisis. I think one of the most fundamental learnings needs to be, when do we call it for what it is and say, this flow, this needs to be interrupted,
Right.
But, the flip side being, I don't think as a species we have much experience with changing everything.
At the species level.
Yeah.
No.
Right? Because it's not just changing your school, but it's going to involve changing your school. It's not just changing your household, but it's going to involve, like, everything in every way has to change. And so if we are successful, like I bet if we recorded how we live today and we do, successfully negotiate some of those goals, that I think the IPCC report is actually pretty conservative. We need to be much more aggressive in our targets than what it says. But let's say we do it, then we will be living a life 10 years from now that's quite different from what it is today. I mean, that's pretty, pretty unbelievable.
You could
In terms
say,
of how we get our energy and
Yeah,
how
everything.
we use
How we
transportation,
move.
everything.
Exactly.
Yeah. Consume
say-
food.
that we'll be living quite differently by choice, or increasingly it will be forced upon us and out of control.
Mhm.
I kind of feel like, yeah, it's going to happen, whether it happens through our agency or our lack of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, this whole series, the season about learning to change, really had two parts to it, two definitions. One of them is, how do I change? How do I transform myself? But it's also, how do we learn in order to transform systems? How do we get larger institutions? How do we get even a species level to reflect change that's needed, that's absolutely essential if we want to survive on the planet?
So when it comes to that, is there something that you guys feel the season did not cover in our learning to change trajectory, or something that you
Yeah.
would like to see?
I mean, I have, along the spirit of urgency and so forth, this big open question about learning being a fairly, I don't know, sort of rational process, right? And that change, I'm thinking that change of the sort that we need should be grounded both in a learning spirit, but also a kind of decisiveness and being grounded in some values, which are, I think, accessed through a different path than what we would conventionally think of as learning.
So all parts of our brain,
Yeah.
not just the rational
Right.
Forebrain.
Right.
left brain kind of thing.
Right.
Mm.
Well, we did. I mean, our season opener with Renee kind of went over some of these issues.
Oh,
I mean,
that's right. That's
yeah.
right. Yeah.
But I think that, again, how do you institutionalize that? Like, because psychology in particular is seen as such an individual thing,
Yeah.
and emotions are seen as a very individual thing. But we want collective emotions and collective value shifts.
So even Renee, though, as a environmental psychologist, was very quick to point out that it's less about what's going on completely within ourselves and more about how in our relationships with people, the conversations we have get to be shifted. And it's that we're back into that, kind of community frame again,
Right.
that all of this stuff has got to flow into our relationships with other people.
So we're, as humans, as a species, we're social animals, right? So learning in community ought to be the most natural thing versus competitive, like I'm better than you are, or I've got more right answers than you do. It's how can we together be smart?
Yeah.
Isn't that the key?
Yeah. And it's also clear at this point that learning in community needs to be learning in communities, plural, and that we need to be expanding our contact outside of what our kind of default home turf might be in a community sense, that the intersectionality of these issues requires that we work together, understand each other, and get connected in a way that I don't think we've ever really had to confront before.
Well, that's where I think the Mothers Out Front model is so beautiful, because Vanessa, if you remember, Vanessa Rule was the director of expansion as well as learning. And we said, gee, what's going on there? She said, well, we learn in communities. Whatever we've learned one place, we try to port over to another or make it available to the people who are organizing. Say, Stacy out in South Bay in San Jose was standing on the shoulders of folks in other states that had maybe a step or two ahead of them.
So let me come back to the question that I posed a couple of minutes ago. What's missing?
For me, a number of the guests touched on the whole systems thinking approach to things, not just seeing households or schools or communities in isolation, but as part of a larger web of systems, whether it's corporations, government, all the different players in the human system. And we touched on that, but I was missing a more thoroughgoing analysis of what that system looks like. Some of our guests talked about understanding power or walking in the hallways of power, and what do you do there once you're there? So I think we could have taken those kinds of themes a step or two further.
For me, a couple big things that are missing from this conversation have been the voice of business, which is unquestionably just has so much power out in the world. Mm-hmm. And it would be great to have that be more part of the equation, because that's, for better or for worse, that's where a lot of the results and the impact are going to come from. The other thing for me is just on the other side of that equation, the voices of communities that have been marginalized from this stuff in the past, I have to assume would have a very different, hopefully complementary, but a different set of expectations and rules to live by and goals and objectives. And I know I personally really look forward to that being, one of the most powerful sources of learning for my future.
Mm-hmm. I want to also build on what you were saying before about values, Curt, because I think it might have been, if we had had the time, to talk with people from faith communities, because those are communities that typically speak from their heart, from their values. And I think there's a lot of learning to change that comes through those values discussions.
Yeah. Where do you hear people talk more often about transformation than in that sort of sphere?
Right. Yeah.
So, I have a couple of places. Like, one is definitely, we recorded all of these interviews before the IPCC report came out.
Yep.
So October 8th is when that report was released. And
2018.
2018. And since then, I think it's clear that, Curt, you already pointed out, if we thought things were bad and we needed to be urgent, well, now we have to be much more so. And so I think everybody's grappling with, how do you learn to change at 10x the speed that you were trying to, which you already thought was quite fast.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what I'm also noticing is how large international institutions, the IPCC and others, are also struggling with this, because suddenly it's clear that the very foundations of current power are going to be challenged, right? Like, the world will not be the same.
You're talking about the sort of uprisings and
everything,
rightward shifts and so forth.
Yeah, and so
wars, mass migrations, that sort of thing.
And so I think that we are suddenly seeing directly in front of our eyes some of the bad news that people were just speculating upon earlier.
Yeah.
And I don't know, and we need to figure out how to address those as well.
And along with that, then I'll say we need to learn how to lift each other up.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're feeling down, we need to learn how to lift each other up and share those sources of courage and hope. As we are recording today, Sunrise Movement is leading an action of 1,000+ people in Washington, D.C., making a firm lobbying push for Green New Deal and for stronger action. And I get such an uplift from the growth of that movement, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. These are young people, teenagers.
Yeah. Well, and young adults,
adults,
people, high school, college, and through their 20s. Mm-hmm. I'm with you in spirit.
So, guys, as we start looking towards the future, yes, it's true that momentous changes are about to happen, but how do you feel like you want to contribute to this shift?
For me personally, it's really important to bring in a systems perspective whenever possible. So when I was seeing tear gas in the streets of Paris and thought that, our friend Curt is in Paris, I wonder how he's doing there, I realized this is a learning moment for us as global citizens, as people that have instant access to information about what's happening all across the globe, and that we don't have the luxury of time to sit and wait and hope that somebody will somehow have a miracle cure, an engineering solution or whatever that will make the issue go away, but that this is affecting whether governments stand or fall, where we can travel, where we feel comfortable, our lifestyle to which we have become accustomed and gotten speaking for myself, gotten a little bit lazy in terms of my choices. It's a collective wake-up call that I think we need to all be thinking in terms of global systems instead of just our own little neighborhood and street.
I think the big thing that I'm looking forward to and want to understand is, as climate becomes central to politics, how it becomes part of how it gets connected to other issues. And so, when we start talking about transforming how people earn a living and what they make and how they make it, that's a very big shift. And it's going to take like entirely new fields of knowledge and new ways of communicating. Like, how will we train workers at every level? So it's like we are trying to create a new society from scratch in a decade. That is awesome in every sense of that term.
And the pieces of that new society are already present, already with us right now. People are pushing those boundaries all over the place. We just have to put it together in ways that we've never put together before.
Absolutely.
I've been thinking a lot about what to pay attention to. There is so much stuff coming at us from so many different directions. Increasingly feels like I have to choose where I put my attention, where I put my energy. And it's absolutely at play when I think about what things do I want to learn, what experiences do I want to have to inform how I go ahead. I'm thinking about the experience we had in New England in eastern Massachusetts this fall with the natural gas explosions, where thousands of households in Lawrence, North Andover, and Andover had their natural gas service, go haywire, blow up. Hundreds of people had their houses destroyed. Thousands of people were displaced. And it's a terrible situation, and it's also a learning opportunity to really engage in that kind of thing. People were literally without any heat, hot water, any capacity to cook food for months, and there's still a few that are in that state. How do we, as a broader community, take that sort of event in and try to learn from it? Clearly, that's hardly the last disaster that's going to face us that's attached to our current energy systems and the changes of climate. How do we respond? How do we reach out to those neighbors and work with them to build back better? I spent a really intense Saturday up in Lawrence through the great organizing work of Mothers Out Front and a few other folks, distributing induction hot plates to people that could run off electricity. People were so appreciative. Many of them, also just super appreciative for the opportunity to just talk with somebody about what their experience was. Every single one of those households has had a really intense thing go on, and I feel like that presents us with the sort of rich in the real world learning experience that we all ought to be grabbing for.
So guys, now, all stories come to an end sooner or later, and we are about to end the season. Any parting thoughts? Anything that you feel that our listeners would like to hear? Some ways in which you've changed over the season, either because of pursuing these topics or elsewhere?
Yeah.
Something that made you learn and change.
Yeah, I would love to hear from people how any of the examples that we've talked about with any of our guests have connected to something in their lives or have inspired you to take on something new. And I think it's through sharing those stories that we can continue to learn from each other.
What I was really impressed with in thinking back over season 3 is the diversity of disciplines, the diversity of perspectives that was represented in the 3 groups that we've spotlighted. And that what I learned is everybody has a contribution to make. With this kind of existential species-level threat that we're faced with now, as you've all pointed out with the most recent reports that we've read, it's not okay to hope that somebody else will take care of it. Everybody has a role to play. Whatever your perspective or career or position, everybody's got a role to play. And we need to find ways to welcome everybody in to the largest tent we could imagine so we can join forces together and be smart together.
Be smart together. That's a pretty good slogan, I would say, to end the season. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And thank you, Dave, and thank you, Curt, and thank you, me.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Climate Conversations podcast is engineered and edited by Dave Lashansky. Project and media support is by my MIT Open Learning colleagues Laura Howells and Michaela Joyce. Please subscribe and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Join the community on climate.mit.edu and be in touch at Twitter, climatex_MIT, and Facebook, group name MIT Climate. For my co-hosts Rajesh Kasturirangan and Dave Damlur, I'm Curt Newton. Thanks so much for listening.